You know the saying, practice makes perfect? You hear that all the time in sports, especially growing up. I know I did. For the most part, it makes sense. I mean, the more you practice something, the harder you try to get better at a skill or a sport, the more likely you are to actually improve, right? Wrong. You see, the people that say this are actually a bunch of liars. I actually found this out with my very short baseball career. I mean, I barely made it into a little bit of high school baseball, but it almost didn't even go past a couple seasons of t-ball because one season of t-ball started out actually pretty strong. I didn't swing at bad pitches. I almost never struck out because the ball was actually on the tee. And then I moved up to Little League where the coach pitches the ball to you. And that's where things for me took a turn for the worse, mainly because, I don't know, the ball was moving and that seemed a lot more difficult than sitting on a tee. And so I didn't know what to do. I kept swinging the bat and I kept striking out and I realized that I wasn't that good at baseball anymore. So I recruited my grandfather to help me learn to hit a moving ball. And we practiced, but I promise you, I didn't get any better. No, I actually got worse. People would tell me practice makes perfect, and I'm like, no, that's for people who are lying. That's not true. And I began to wonder if I was really cut out for this. And so after that season, I spent a little time retired from baseball so I could pursue other options like Legos, things like that. Maybe for you, it's not baseball. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's your grades, or maybe it's another sport you're trying to play, or maybe you're trying to play the tuba. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's a friendship that you've been trying to make work. And it felt like you were going backwards and not forwards, and then maybe you thought about quitting. I would imagine that we probably all experience this a little differently in a few specific areas of our lives, right? But I bet there's one area where most of us have had this feeling before. Right here in church. See, this is an area where we probably feel like we're moving backwards more than anything else is when it comes to our relationship or lack thereof with God. We come to church, we want to get closer to God, so we try to start reading our Bible more, or praying more, going to church more, doing the things that we think are going to make us closer to God. But then things get busy, and so we just kind of stop, or we forget, or we leave it on the sidelines. Or we make a mistake that leaves us feeling like we're further from God than before we even started. And so we try and then we fail again. Maybe you're already pretty uncertain about this God thing to begin with, but you decided to pray about something as a last-ditch effort and then nothing changed, so you just assumed, well, it must be me. I'm sure it's not God, it must be me. And then things got worse instead of getting better. Before long, we began to think about the same things I thought about in Little League Baseball. I've tried to get better at this, and it's just not working. Maybe this is just not for me. And then if we were really honest, we think, well, maybe it's not for anybody. Or maybe this is not even real. I mean, of course, we don't say that out loud. How dare we say that out loud? We just slowly start moving in another direction. So we just stop praying, stop showing up. We get busy with other things. We keep our distance from God, from church, from even the people that we know are close to Him. And I just wonder if I were to put this up far or near and ask you where you think you are, whether you're far or whether you're near, what would you say about your relationship with God? I bet most of us would probably find ourselves maybe somewhere in the middle, but probably a little closer to the far end. It's not like we want to be there necessarily, but what else are we supposed to do when we've tried and we feel like this whole God thing, the church thing, is just not always working out for us? I mean, are there even any other options? What are we supposed to do if we've already started to check out and walk away? No matter where you are in your spiritual life, the scripture we're going to look at today has something to say to all of us. Because we're not just talking about some guys who thought about giving up or moving on. We're talking about two guys who were already on the road out of town. They had already given up. They had already quit. Just to give you some background on these guys, these were people that were involved with Jesus. They had expectations of what following him, of what being in his crowd might look like. They anticipated him to be the next great king. In fact, many people left their jobs and their homes to follow him. So you can just imagine how great their surprise was when Jesus was put to death on the cross. This left all of his followers wondering, now what? Last week, we said that Mary, she just sat right outside of the tomb waiting. Like many of Jesus' followers, she didn't know what to do. And that's where this passage begins, on the very same day. Now, that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus. This was about 7 miles from Jerusalem, a long way to walk. They were talking to each other about everything that had happened, probably filled with a bunch of disappointment. So these two followers of Jesus are walking down the road and they're talking about everything that had happened. Now, what they're talking about, I'm sure, was interesting, but what really matters is the direction they're headed. Luke says they're headed towards Emmaus, away from Jerusalem. These two were literally walking away from it all. Their supposed king had just died. You can't follow a king who's dead. So now what? Maybe they were ready to call it quits. Maybe they just wanted a break. We don't know what their exact intention was, but the point is they had made a decision to leave. They were checking out. And maybe some of you are walking down that road right now. Maybe you had an encounter with Jesus at one point. Maybe it was at camp one summer or on a retreat. And maybe it all felt real at the time, but then things changed. And it just doesn't feel the same anymore. The changes you saw in yourself, they started to fade. And so you started walking back to where you used to be before Jesus was ever even a part of the picture. Now, if that's you, then you've got to see what happens next. Because there's something that you need to know about Jesus that might be a game changer for you. See, what happened next was totally unexpected. As they talked and as they discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him, Luke tells us. And suddenly, Jesus himself, the risen Son of God, comes up and walks along with them. I have no idea why they didn't recognize him. Maybe he looked different. Or maybe they just weren't expecting him to. Or maybe it just didn't register. I don't know. But they didn't recognize him, and he didn't immediately stop them and say, "Hey, morons, it's me. Turn around. Let's go back." No, he just comes alongside of them, and he just walks. Not only that, but Jesus begins to just chat with them, ask them some questions. How's it going? At one point, Jesus even tells them about how the prophets from years earlier had told them that this was going to happen. And he began to teach them about how all of this was part of God's plan. And finally, it got late. And they'd all walked together a really long way. And so the three of them stopped for the night and had supper. And around the table, Jesus picked up some bread and he began to pass it out. And it was an eerily similar moment to a moment they had just had days before. And right at that moment, it says, then their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And he disappeared from their sight. And they asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened up the scriptures to us? See, they finally recognized that the guy who had traveled all that way with them was Jesus. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he vanishes. And you can just imagine what they're thinking. Dude, that was Jesus. But what was he doing here? I mean, shouldn't he be appearing to people who were headed towards Jerusalem, not walking away from the scene? But he walked with us, and our hearts were burning because of him. And that's what they learned that day. It's what many of us desperately need to hear. They thought they were far, and they were really near. Even when they were walking away. See, they would have been right had it been up to just them, but it wasn't. They might have been walking away. They might have been far from Jesus, But he was walking with them, and they ran into a truth that's going to be pretty freeing for a lot of us, and it's this: Jesus is near even when you're far. Let me say it again. Jesus is near even when you're far. You might be walking away from Jesus, but Jesus is not walking away from you. No, he's walking with you. He's coming after you, not to get you, but because he loves you. And that is a really huge deal, because it means that if you want to come back, all you have to do is turn around. You don't need to promise anything. You don't need to try to earn anything. You don't need to climb some spiritual mountain back to where you were. No, all you have to do is turn around. And that's what these guys did. They got up. They returned at once to Jerusalem. And that's my question for you. Where are you? Is there an area of your life where you've begun to walk in the other direction? Maybe it isn't in obvious ways, but maybe in small, subtle ways. Have you begun to move in reverse, to back away from him, to just check out? If so, I want you to know that you're not alone. Nearly every follower of Jesus will encounter a moment when they find themselves walking down the road away from the scene. And the thing you have to decide is how you're going to answer the question, now what? Here are just a few things you got to remember in those moments. You've got to notice him. Sometimes when we're busy walking away from God, we don't even notice that he's still with us. Just like the two guys on the road, we can go for miles, for months in the wrong direction, feeling disappointed by God, and fail to notice that Jesus was with us the whole time. So today, I want to challenge you to take notice. Pay attention to the burning in your heart. Where do you sense God at work in your life, even when you're walking away? Where do you sense God at work in the world around you? Even on days when you feel like a million miles away, even on days when you begin to wonder if he even exists, even on days when you think that he might just be mad at you, maybe if you were to just look up and turn around, you'll find that he's with you all along. The next thing you need to do is not only notice him, but you need to just turn around. I mean, when the men realized that Jesus was with them, it changed everything. Notice that. It changed the direction that they were headed. They immediately turned around and they began walking back. And you can do the same thing. Just turn around. If you've wandered off into bad relationships, you can turn around and you can go back. If you've wandered off into some partying, some habits that you know you shouldn't, you can turn around and you go back. If you've begun to ignore your relationship with God, you can turn around and you can go back. The truth is that when you and I are walking away, when we find ourselves going backwards in our faith, Jesus is not as far off as you think he might be. And the secret in this is not to muster up the courage and the willpower to make it all the way back to Jerusalem on your own. No, the gospel tells us that Jesus actually comes and walks alongside of them as they're walking the wrong way and reveals himself to us and gives us the invitation to simply turn around. Maybe you don't even consider yourself a Christian. Maybe you're thinking about giving all of this up because it's just not for you. I want you to know this. Wherever your doubt or your unbelief takes you, it will never take you away from Jesus. He wants to be with you no matter what. And when you get to the moment when you think that you're ready to find your way back to him, you don't have to worry. He's right there. Just turn around to him, because Jesus is near even when you are far.